I would vote for Mr. Starmer, I promise you. If Mr. Starmer said, and I will take us back into the EU without another referenda for the birds, he'd get my vote.
Stanley Johnson, welcome to the first edition of a new interview series hosted by the Press Club in Brussels and Keeping Channels Open, a dialogue network for UK-EU US relations.
Well, I feel honoured to be on the first show. I hope it will be a very long-running show, and you've certainly got an important task on your hands.
Let's start with the UK-EU.
Yes, of
so
course.
obviously that's something very close to your
Well,
heart.
I tell you, I was just so extremely lucky to be literally one of the very first Brits to come to Brussels in 1973, literally 2 or 3 months after we joined. We joined 1st January 1973. I know that I started work in Brussels on, I think, the 10th of April 1973. So I was there right from the start and had this fantastic chance, because no sooner had Britain joined than we put into effect also something decided at the Paris summit in October of 72, the first environment policy, which is where I'm here today. And my concern is that Britain shouldn't forget that it's part of this wider whatever you like to call it, geophysical unity, which is called the wider Europe. We need to rebuild the links here, and that's what you're about. Rebuilding these links, so important.
So why did the UK leave some of, like, the European Environmental Agency, Erasmus, Horizon, programs, Creative Europe? There were certain things we still could have stayed part of. So why did we not? Because obviously it was a very close vote in 2016 in the referendum. So that would have actually reflected the population's desire.
An interesting analysis, that, isn't it? Okay, because it's a very close vote, at least we ought to stay in some things. I like that thought. I think I might use that thought. I think what happened is that somehow we all got all these agencies which had a link with Europe, and some were actually European agencies themselves, have got, as it were, tarred with the same brush. And the very word Europe has caused hackles to rise. Coming back to the European Environment Agency, I was very heavily involved in writing the first statutes for the European Environment Agency. It came into being, it was set up in Denmark, but it has antenna in all the different countries of the EU, and it does fantastically good work on a pan-EU basis. But I say pan-EU, but we also deliberately wrote into the statute of that agency the fact that non-EU member countries can be full members of the agency. And we have some. We have Norway, we have Turkey, we have Switzerland, we have Liechtenstein. We have other countries who are there as associate members, but Britain, which was a full member, we had the first president of the agency's board, we had the first or second director general. We're not there. We need now to get back as a full member of the European Environment Agency. That's not saying we're going to accept EU environmental rules. The Environment Agency doesn't make the rules. They're made by the Council and the Parliament and the tripartite dialogues which we have. But we need to be there, and we really need to be there. And the good thing from my point of view is we have come back, at least as an associate member for Horizon. That's a start.
It's fantastic news, isn't it? What was the reaction, for example, of your son? I mean, didn't you talk to him? I mean, you were very close to him. He was the foreign minister. He was prime minister.
Are we allowed to say pants on air? I mean, I think I bored the pants off him on the subject of the European Environment Agency. I think he thought I was obsessed by it. I am obsessed by it because I cannot see how you can deal with these issues without having a perspective. Our air becomes Europe's air. Our dirty water becomes Europe's dirty water. If we want to do product trading, and we do trade in products, we have to have broadly similar standards. Probably we have to have exactly similar standards, otherwise you can have barriers to trade. It is also obvious that I cannot understand. My thought is that there is still in the British Conservative Party a group of people who say, oh gosh, we better not lose what's known as the Red Wall, our Red Wall supporters. My feeling is that we've lost our Red Wall supporters anyway. So we may as well do what we want to do, is say, look, we do think we must rebuild these bridges. It's not going back into Europe. That's another issue, and that's a debate for another time. But gosh, in so many ways is a vital issue.
I mean, certainly opinion polls show that most people in the UK actually think Brexit's a mistake and also would like a closer relationship. And that includes many people in the Red Wall as well.
Does it? I hadn't spotted that.
Yeah, apparently there are polls being done that show that actually people in the Red Wall would not be put off if, in fact, we did rejoin or reconnect certain things with the European Union.
So glad to hear you say that.
Jobs.
I would have thought the environment would be an absolute natural one to put in here.
Normally, the UK government had made commitments on environmental standards anyway to keep up with those. But yet there's always a risk, isn't it, that we could diverge the wrong way?
So the UK government has made commitments. Some of these are commitments made at the dispatch box in the House of Commons. The great thing is when we were in the EU was those commitments could be backed up by some person like you writing a letter off to Brussels saying, I don't think the government is really doing its stuff. And then you could take it up with the Commission. If the Commission didn't like it, it could bring an infraction procedure. If the infraction procedure went against the UK, in this case, it could go to the European Court. So there was a whole, as it were, there were teeth. And I think what has happened is that we've lost the teeth, and now we are in a slightly more nebulous situation where, yes, we have the word of ministers at the dispatch box and these are very serious things, but actually it's not justiciable in the way that enforcing a EU directive was.
Because there is a movement in the UK among some Conservatives or others that there is no such thing as climate change, and that actually we shouldn't pay all these great costs to include environmental regulation.
It's interesting you raised this.
Does that worry you?
And well, isn't it raised this in the week that we've just had the memorial service for Nigel Lawson in Westminster Abbey, and it is true that there has been a, as it were, growing articulateness of people out there now questioning. Now, you've got to be suspicious about all this. Who is behind a lot of this stuff? Go back to America. Who was behind the US Senate voting 100-1 against the US ratifying, what was called the Kyoto Treaty? It was business. It was US business. It was US business lobbying the senators. And I'm not saying that business is getting hold of each individual MP and bring to their attention. But don't tell me that business doesn't, up to a point at least, welcome the fact that, people raising questions about net zero and so on and so forth, because, they...
A lot of that's coming from the US,
I think
and the war on woke and all that.
I think a lot of that is coming from the US.
So what are the prospects now? I mean, obviously, Rishi Sunak's government has come into power. We've rejoined Horizon. We've managed to make an agreement about the Northern Ireland Protocol as well. What do you hope is going to happen next?
Well, just think about it. There's some, if you think of the reality, what are the things the European Commission has on the table at the moment, which are tremendously important? Okay, there's the European Green Deal, which sets the overall framework, but then you've got some specific things which are out there now. There's the Net Zero Industry Act, which is coming forward. There's the critical raw materials regulation coming forward. Now, these are things we can't afford not to be in some way part of, because believe me, if we don't, work in a common progress with Europe, we shall be excluded.
But how can we convince the Europeans that Britain is serious about being a reliable partner in the future, given that actually the Europeans are sort of fed up a bit with us now after 7 years?
We're not saying that Britain is now saying, please can we rejoin?
No.
Except I think Britain ought to say, please can we rejoin the European Environment Agency? But Britain is not saying, can we, as it were, come back as fully paid up, fully fledged members of the European Union in its current or expanded form. No, that is probably a debate for the future, but it's completely crazy to think we can't build, obviously Horizon was one aspect, but there are a whole lot of other ones which we ought to be following up now.
Like what? Erasmus,
Erasmus,
agri-food?
Erasmus would be one. You say to yourself, do we really need separate patent regime as we've got? That's just a piece of nonsense. The licensing of chemical products. Why do we need our own REACH scheme, which is the chemical evaluation scheme? Why do we need our own, as it were, FDA? If we want products to be circulating within Europe, then we need to have at least common recognition.
Do you regret that the UK left the EU?
I do, no question about it.
Do you think the British public are sort of waking up onto this, that it wasn't a great idea? Because the polls show that they are. But
I
most
know,
people.
but what's to say? Because you never know about polls, do you? I think the great British public will be convinced by the economic arguments, and if it was, consistently and plausibly shown that we've suffered a terrific economic hit through not being in the EU, that would be one factor. I think there's the irritation factor of having to go into a different passport line and so on and so forth. I know I wouldn't rely on the British public pulling this chestnut out of the fire. I think
It's complicated.
I think frankly, I think I wasn't sure I was very in favour of a referendum. I don't particularly want it. I thought that was a very bad idea to have a referendum.
Sure.
I think it'd be a bad idea to have another referendum. I think I would vote for Mr. Starmer. I promise you. If Mr. Starmer said, "And I will take us back into the EU without another referenda for the birds," he'd get my vote, I can tell you.
Really? So you would advocate that without another referendum?
Oh, I certainly would.
Or not even the single market first, joint
Look,
rejoin, and then EU later? You'd actually want us to go right back in there with 2 years of negotiation up to there?
I think it'd be a big mistake to say we'll only go back in if we have another referendum. I think you have to say, look, if a politician like Keir Starmer had enough sense that this is a vital issue, and he says, well, sorry, part of my program is that we will seek to renegotiate, seek to come back into the EU. That's what Heath said in the run up to the 1970 election. I was working in the Conservative Republic. The idea that you need a referendum, big mistake.
So just to finally, a kind of slightly difficult question for you, really. But the legacy of your son's premiership, obviously your son advocated leaving the EU in the end. And do you think he's had any realization that this wasn't a good thing for the country?
Yeah, I very much doubt that. As Chow Lai said, when asked his opinion of whether the French Revolution had been a success or not, he said, I think it's too early to say. I think that Boris's line would almost certainly be, I don't see how he could diverge from the line he took.
But he must regret some of it because it's not ended very well for him.
I can't speak about that. And I don't think the EU was in any way an issue which arose in the context of the assassination carried out by the Conservative Party on the man who had actually given them an 80-seat majority. I don't think the EU was a.
Do you regret any of the rhetoric, though? Because one thing I'm always advocating is that in our public comments, we should not be insulting each other or insulting Europeans. Europeans shouldn't be insulting Britain. I mean, that's very important in diplomacy. Do you regret any of the sort of commentary that was coming out from some some British politicians?
You mean about the EU-UK relationship?
Because obviously the EU politicians here take it to heart very much when they feel that people are saying unpleasant things like the EU's like the Soviet Union.
Well, I hope they'll listen to your broadcast.
Well, then we have to move on.
I hope they'll listen to your broadcast, Sandra, because I do. Well, actually, I do speak of someone now who now has a French passport, and I'm very happy about that. But I honestly don't believe that Britain should be slagging off the EU or the EU should be slagging off Britain. I find it unimaginable. So,
final comment then. Next steps. What's your big hope, and why is this cooperation so essential for the future?
The big environmental issues, and we're talking about climate change, we're talking about diversity. Back in the 70s, when I was here, we were talking about the ozone layer depletion, which was not the issue at the time, which happily, as far as I'm concerned, these are the big issues. It's not so much whether or not Britain has a good relationship with the EU, but it's whether or not we are being effective. And I think Britain has a fantastic amount to contribute to the EU. On the environmental side, for example, a lot of the stuff I wrote here, and we all wrote here, came because British delegates and British ministers fought hard. They said, we've had some good ideas, let's disseminate them throughout Europe.
So a fantastic common history together. We have to rebuild the trust, rebuild those links, and rebuild that cooperation at all levels. And let's hope for the future. Thank you.
Well, exactly. Let's hope. Well, thank you for having me tonight.